So dudes, it's your boy Tuhu. If y'all watched my video from yesterday, the one where I rant about how I'm a gacha god or something like that, I appreciate y'all coming back, and boy do I have a treat for you today, because I'm about to piss off an entire community by comparing Wuthering Waves to Genshin Impact. Surely nothing's gonna go wrong with this one. Let me set the context for this video first, and this is gonna take a hot minute. Ever since Genshin Impact came out 4 years ago, I always kinda knew that we'd start seeing Genshin clones, come out eventually. I mean, that's only natural whenever something is really successful, right? Other people are gonna want to try to copy that and the success that it had. And as we've seen over the past year or so, we've gotten announcements for, upcoming gacha games such as Project Mugen, Arknight's Enfield, Azure Permilia, and of course the first one to actually drop after Genshin, Wuthering Waves. And before you ask, no, I don't count Tower of Fantasy, especially not when the TOF devs are already working on NTE. Maybe the second time around, they'll make a game that people actually care about. But it's not just because, Wuwa came out after Genshin, so obviously it's a Genshin clone, that I'm calling it that, right? Wuthering Waves, like Genshin Impact, is also a 3D open-world anime RPG with many of the same gameplay features as Genshin, such as open-world exploration, real-time action combat, and of course the gacha banners for both characters and weapons. It goes even further than that, of course. Characters and weapons having dupes that you can obtain that make them stronger, specific exploration elements like chests, oculi called caskets in Wuwa, statues called resonance nexi. The ecosystem is based on the artifact system in Genshin, weekly bosses that you can only do 3 times a week for rewards, and Spiral Abyss called Tower of Adversity in Wuwa. Basically, Wuthering Waves is quite literally Genshin if it were developed by a different studio. It's even more hilarious when you realize that Kuro Game, the developers of Wuthering Waves, was founded by several ex-MiHoYo employees who made Kuro Game's first gacha game called Punishing Gray Raven. I also want to make it clear here that whenever I call Wuwa or any other gacha game for that matter a Genshin clone, usually I don't mean it in a derogatory way, because I actually hold Genshin Impact in a very high regard. So if another gacha game comes out that looks very clearly inspired by Genshin, I call it a Genshin clone because that's what it is, and frankly, it's the easiest way to describe a new gacha game to people since, most people are probably already familiar with Genshin. Now, the reason why I want to compare Wuwa to Genshin is because I want to lay out all the areas where I think Wuwa is superior to Genshin and where it could still do a better job so far. If you watched my previous video, I play a lot of gacha games to the point where I have the audacity to call myself the god of gacha games, and having played gacha for the past 7 years now, I'm personally quite invested in seeing how gacha games develop and evolve over time. And with Genshin Impact pointing the gacha industry in a very clear direction since its release, I'd like to see how future gachas, including the Genshin clones as I like to call them, take the formula that Genshin's established with both itself, Star Rail, and most recently Z3, and improve upon it and make it their own. So with all that in mind, what I want to know is, what are the key things that Wuthering Waves has done so far to make it stand out from the game that started it all, right? How does it improve over Genshin, and how could it still improve itself? Let's start with what Wuwa does better than Genshin, and the most important of which is the combat. It's obvious to me that Kuro Game has focused heavily on the combat gameplay thanks to their experience developing and managing PGR beforehand. In Genshin Impact, combat is all about the elemental reaction system, right? 2 or 3 different elements being used together against the same enemies to create powerful reactions that help you defeat them more effectively. So you're meant to create a team with characters with the elements that you need to utilize those reactions that you want to use against those enemies. But in Wuthering Waves, there is no elemental reaction system. Characters do have elements, sure, but they don't have the same significance as they do in a game like Genshin Impact. Instead, what Wuwa does is it focuses on your individual performance with each character, both defensively and offensively. All enemy attacks can be dodged, and if you dodge them properly, the game gives you a special sound effect and a short period of bullet time where the game briefly slows down to indicate that you've successfully dodged an enemy attack. Enemies also have certain attacks that can be parried, indicated by a brief golden circle or ring that appears near them, and if you hit those enemies at the exact moment that they're about to hit you, you get a very flashy parry effect. Both dodging and parrying prevent you from taking any damage. On a side note, not only can you air dodge in this game too, but if you successfully air dodge an attack, the game will let you dodge again, which normally isn't possible if you're not in combat. This means that even in the air, you can completely defend yourself from an enemy's multi-hitting aerial attack and make Wuthering Waves feel a little bit like Third Strike. This, combined with the fact that Wuwa does its best Elden Ring impression by throwing you bosses that love spamming delayed attacks all the goddamn time at your ass, creates a style of gameplay that is very engaging and challenging. Because there's no reaction system that lets you melt bosses like you can in Genshin, and bosses aren't as easily hard countered, you have to respect the enemies in Wuwa. And since Zhongli doesn't exist in this game yet, parrying and more importantly dodging is something you have to get good at in order to beat the more challenging levels. Of course, it's not just the defensive play that makes Wuwa combat so engaging. The characters themselves also have very distinct playstyles, and Wuwa's endgame content strongly encourages you to learn how to play them optimally. Sanhua, for example, plays very heavily off of her resonance thing, I forget exactly what it's called, where she does extra ice damage if you time her heavy attack with the highlighted section of her resonance bar. Genshin's skill becomes a counter if you use it like a parry. Jian's ult has a second form that does even more damage if you use it after his intro skill or something like that, and Jinshi and Changli both have air combos like they're playing Marvel fucking 3. Don't get me wrong, I do like Genshin's combat because of the team building aspect and the satisfaction of hitting your team's rotations perfectly, but once you've played Genshin for long enough and you build the meta teams that can tackle any content, you can just sort of like ignore whatever the enemies are doing and just destroy them either way. Or put another way, you basically win at the team lineup screen. That and, well, MiHoYo refuses to put in any harder content than, Spiral Abyss due to concerns over player anxiety, in case you couldn't tell that already with their new theater game mode. So the whole point of Wuwa's combat is to learn both the offensive and defensive sides to the game and combine them to beat hard bosses, and when you do, that's when the gameplay becomes peak. There's a good reason why I said earlier that it feels like Kuro game focused specifically on their combat gameplay because they absolutely nailed it. The one thing that I would kinda like to see different is if Wuwa put a little bit more emphasis on team building or at least more off-field capabilities for characters, but that's mainly the Genshin side of me talking, and I'm sure future characters will take care of that. For now though, Wuwa's core combat mechanics are solid as they are. The second most important improvement over Genshin Impact is, and I shit you not, a fucking story skip button. Now, I realize that this is something that Wuwa players and Genshin players too for that matter have discussed on Twitter before, and I myself have talked about it multiple times in the past, but considering I've dealt with the past 4 years worth of bullshit from MiHoYo and 2 of their games not having one, you get to hear me bitch about it yet again, so here we go. Because gacha games are live service games that don't usually have a finite end to them, unless they get EOS'd of course, they typically have big, large-scale stories with extensive lore and lots of characters whose backstories help further expand that lore or like contribute to the main story in some way. This means that the story is usually treated as like a main feature of gacha games, which in turn means that they can take up a lot of your time playing those gachas if you choose to sit down and read through all of it. But would it surprise you to know that a lot of gacha players out there don't care for the story of the gachas that they play for any number of reasons, right? Maybe the story itself isn't that good, or they only care for the actual gameplay, and so the story is secondary even if it were good. Or in my case, since I'm juggling 12 different frickin' gacha games, I simply don't have the time to read any of them even if I wanted to, not at the moment at least. Whatever the reason, having a skip button solves this dilemma, because if you don't care for the story, you can just skip that shit and continue on with the rest of the game. And if you do want to read the story, well, you can just ignore that skip button and keep reading. Quick side note here, for those of you who disagree and think that you should read the story since it's part of the game or whatever, my counterpoint is that these are called gacha games, right, as in you play the damn game, and therefore their gameplay should be prioritized over the story. Like, if you want something that does the opposite, well, from where I come from, right, we call those visual novels, which ironically typically have skip buttons too. And by the way, some gacha games feature a quick synopsis of what you're skipping, so that way you still have the main gist of what's going on, which I think is the best way to handle this, and something MiHoYo should strongly consider doing as well. I'm not exactly sure how to properly convey to you how infuriating it is to have to play Genshin or Star Rail without a proper skip button. Like, it's a mainstay feature of gacha games, man. Like, if I had to think of an example, it'd be like when Battlefield 2042 came out without a lot of the features that previous Battlefield titles had. Like, no server browser, or even a goddamn scoreboard, and of course players were fucking pissed. And to my knowledge, Genshin Impact is the first major gacha to not have it, the skip button that is, so it's very jarring to know that the biggest gacha game in the world is missing something as simple as a goddamn skip button. Oh, and also, it would be one thing if Genshin and Star Rail had stories that were actually good. Like, I still wouldn't be happy that you can't skip them, but if you're gonna force me to go through them, I can at least be somewhat entertained. But the vast majority of Genshin and Star Rail stories straddled the spectrum of, like, decently okay to I would rather watch my artifacts and relics roll nothing but flat stats, and the parts where there's some legitimate potential are ruined by MiHoYo's absolute lack of proper pacing, obsession with titles and lingo and names that make the story sound more intelligent than it really is, and insistence on 3D storytelling with generic-ass NPC models and stock animations. And so with all this in mind, it feels to me like MiHoYo is forcing their stories down your goddamn throat because they take their own stories way too fucking seriously and want you to take them seriously too, whether you want to or not. And their stories aren't even that good to begin with, which makes it even worse. And by doing this, they don't respect your own choices and, more importantly, your own time. So you can imagine how glad I am to know that Wuthering Waves does have a skip button. Like, I've heard some, you know, not great things about Wuwa's story so far, but I'll always take an inferior story that lets me just skip it over a mediocre story that I have to spend the next God knows how many hours spamming left click through that shit because I know reading it is gonna be a goddamn waste of my time. And not only is it on principle that I think all gacha games should have skip buttons for the stories, but it's also because I don't want MiHoYo's tendency of removing it to be a recurring feature for future gacha games that they inspire, right? They can set the trend for other things like, you know, soft and hard pities, $100 packs, character and weapon banners, all that bullshit. But when it comes to this topic specifically, being able to skip story, no, that is one of the few red lines that, when it comes to gacha games, I will not accept being crossed. So MiHoYo and anyone else who tries this shit can go fuck themselves. To be fair, it seems like MiHoYo has learned their lesson at least a little, right? Because in Z3, that game does let you skip some of its story, so at least they're showing some improvement there. And thank God Kuro Game isn't going down the same path. The third key improvement here is with Kuro Game themselves. More to the point, they've demonstrated that they listen to their community to a much bigger extent than MiHoYo does. The example that's most relevant here is, again, the story skip function, because when Wuwa first came out, you could only skip like part of the story, not all of it. Like, you still had to read through like the main story. But since then, Kuro has updated it so that you can skip everything now if you want. Well, not quite everything, because you still have to watch the custom animated cutscenes in the story, but hey, at least those are fun to watch. They've also been busting their balls, implementing other forms of feedback from their players, and doing everything they can to further improve and optimize their game. Hell, the majority of their 1.1 patch notes apparently were like bug fixes and changes to the base game. You might have seen that tweet as well, talking about how apparently the lights in their offices didn't go out for like a month straight or something. But the single biggest thing that they did was back when they gave out that free 5-star selectable character to all players in response to the game being launched with a lot of bugs and performance issues, I think it was. And it's not just because, oh my god, right, they give out a free 5-star character, Genshin could never, right? While Wuwa is undoubtedly a Genshin clone, they still have to compete with Genshin, right? It's not like Genshin's going anywhere, and be a good enough game itself where people will still stick with it, right? Because if it turned out to be shit, people just go back to playing Genshin again. The problem with this is that they were never gonna surpass Genshin, or in other words, they were never gonna be the Genshin killer that some people thought they would be. And before the sales numbers started coming out, we didn't know how successful it was gonna end up being. So for a studio like Kuro Game, that's obviously much smaller than MiHoYo, and trying to launch a massive game like Wuwa, to give out not just any compensation for the game's less than ideal launch performance or whatever the reason ended up being, but a free 5-star characters with no conditions to it other than just log into the game between now and the next year or whatever, and you can just straight up pick whichever perma 5-star you want, right? That means quite a bit. Since you know for a fact that they lost out on a decent chunk of money by doing that. right? They could have just made more money by not doing something like that and just giving us some other compensation instead, right? Oh, here's a free multi, for example. But nope, here you go, free 5-star. Oh, and also free 5-star weapon from the perma banner too, just for reaching UL 45 to go with them. And you compare this to whatever the fuck MiHoYo does when it comes to how they handle community feedback, which basically boils down to whatever's wrong with our current game, we'll give you like 100 primos per issue, and anything bigger than that, we'll just fix in our next game, Genshin Star 02 Electric Boogaloo. And all of a sudden you realize that Kuro game just feels way more receptive to feedback from their own community. I'm also aware of the whole Novelette compensation thing where we got a whole ass multi, which is nice, but like, holy shit, that whole situation is its own fucking shit show that I could go on about in a separate video. Now, it hasn't all been perfect for Kuro game, of course. Like, they've had hiccups along the way, such as several episodes of JP server drama, notably the mistranslation of, I think, one of Jian's skills, or like weapon or something, dissatisfaction, especially on the Chinese server, with Wuwa's apparently ongoing issues on mobile, right, for mobile devices, phones, and tablets or whatever, and the fact that this is a Chinese game with Chinese developers, so naturally the community that they're going to pay the most attention to is the Chinese server. But so far, it seems that Kuro's done a good enough job of listening to player feedback, and it contrasted sharply enough with whatever MiHoYo has or hasn't done for their own communities that I felt the need to list it as the third key improvement that they've done over Genshin Impact. Personally, my most important takeaway from this is the fact that Kuro Games seems to be okay with letting their community have a say in what kind of direction they want to see Wuthering Waves go in, as opposed to MiHoYo, where they're gonna develop their games their own way, however they want, and you're gonna fucking like it. Like, between MiHoYo's sheer arrogance and Kuro Game, I think I'll take Kuro. Again, gacha games are live service games, so it's very important for developers to be able to listen to feedback from their communities to help them make the best possible games that they can. And for smaller studios like Kuro Game, who have to compete with a titan like Genshin, right? This is a big way for them to set themselves apart from MiHoYo, since again, MiHoYo doesn't exactly have a great track record in this regard. Those are it for the most important improvements, so let me rapid fire out some more specific improvements that I like in Wuwa, the biggest of which is how they handle the weapon banners in the game. The limited weapon banner will always give you the weapon on rate up, or in other words, there are no chances to get spooked or get like any off rate ups or anything like that. They also separate the perma banners into characters and weapons, and the standard weapon banner lets you set which weapon you actually want to get when you eventually do get a 5-star. This makes rolling these weapon banners actually worth it since you know what you're gonna get, and therefore you have something to look forward to and work towards. And this is such a godsend compared to the usual shit that MiHoYo does with their standard banners that just combine both perma characters and weapons, so you never really know what you're gonna get. Exploration is also a much smoother experience and an overall big improvement over Genshin's, since in Wuwa you have better universal movement such as faster vaulting, a higher jump that also lets you double jump, and wall running. Your characters also don't lose stamina while they're sprinting, only when dashing, wall running, swimming, or when they're in combat, and you have a much higher fall damage ceiling, as in you can jump from higher places and not take fall damage or not take as much. I also really like this one feature where your character can still climb past the edges of cliffs even if they're sticking out a little bit, which would normally be a giant pain in the ass to deal with in Genshin. You also have gadgets that are very clearly inspired by some of the gadgets in Genshin, so the loot mapper is a treasure compass, the grappling hook is the tether function, I guess, and the sensor is the elemental vision, but all of these are much easier to use in Wuthering Waves, and you can easily switch between them with the gadget wheel. The last thing I can think of for now is the echoes, which are Wuwa's take on artifacts. Rather than being a boring set of, well, artifacts, echoes are like the copies of enemies that you fight up in the overworld, which even includes the elite bosses, so it gives the game a bit of a Pokemon vibe, for lack of a better phrase, since you're fighting enemies and then you're capturing them to use for yourself, which I think is a pretty cool twist on the artifact gear system. Not only that, but the main echo that a character equips, the one at the very top, can also be used directly in battle when you press Q on keyboard and whatever it is on controller, and it'll perform an attack that's based on the echo that's being currently equipped. So not only is your gear giving your characters extra big stats, but they're also directly assisting your characters in battle by giving them an extra powerful move that they can can use when everything else they have is on cooldown or something. Alright, now it's time for me to go over the areas in which I think Wuwa could still improve in, and I'll start with the two that personally bother me the most. The first one is the visuals of the game and the overall exploration experience. Let me give it to you straight, Wuthering Waves does not look that good compared to Genshin Impact. Say what you will about Genshin, but that game is fucking gorgeous. Like, holy shit, this game is pure fucking weeb eye candy. Right? The environments, the colors, the saturation levels, the contrasts, the playable character models, just about everything in Genshin, when it comes to visuals, miHoYo got absolutely right. On the other hand, Wuthering Waves doesn't look bad per se, but compared to whatever technomagical hacks that miHoYo's developed to make Genshin look the way it does, Wuwa unfortunately doesn't really hold up very well. My main issue with Wuwa's visuals is that I can't help but think that there's like a bit of a blur filter over the entire game that's basically on all the time, and I'm not sure how to get rid of it. The best way that I can demonstrate this is by comparing how characters look from like a distant camera angle. In Genshin, characters are still well defined and easy to distinguish, whereas in Wuwa, the facial features on Wuwa characters start getting blurry and hard to make out. And I assure you, this isn't just because I wear glasses. I also feel like there isn't much diversity in the color palettes that you see throughout Wuwa's overworld, and that the colors that are used seem darker or less saturated or a bit more washed out, however you describe it. Clearly you can tell I'm a super big art expert and therefore totally qualified to talk about shit like this. But I don't think you need to be like an art expert or anything like that to see what I'm trying to get at here, especially if you're like me, where you're coming from a game that's basically sex for the weeb eyes, if you can imagine that, to Wuwa. I hesitate to call this a straight downgrade though, because a lot of this can be attributed to just a different art direction or aesthetic. Like, I've had my viewers tell me that the reason why Wuwa looks the way it does is because the setting is supposed to be post-apocalyptic. But having a darker setting story-wise should not be an excuse to not make your game look as good as it can. Like, I'm not, trying to say that Kuro Games should suddenly start splashing bright-ass rainbow colors everywhere from now on, but I do think that they can do a better job of portraying their colors and visuals in a way that's more striking and memorable than, how they are now. Right? Like, Genshin has a few areas that are darker and have less color diversity than usual, such as Seirai Island, Surumi Island before you clear out the fog, that is, the Chasm, and Enkanomiya, but all of those areas are still very visually impressive, or at least leave an impression on you. It also doesn't help that when I first started playing Wuthering Waves, I had to fiddle with the settings to make the game look better, whereas in Genshin, I didn't have to change shit. Everything just worked right out the gate. Speaking of memorable, because of its superior visuals, I still heavily prefer Genshin's exploration over Wuwa's, and this is despite, as I said earlier, Wuwa having the superior exploration mechanics. The reason why is because the main appeal of Genshin Impact, for me anyway, has been the sheer vibes of playing that game while running around the map exploring stuff. Right? Because if you're looking for a smooth exploration experience, you can find that in other games, whereas the vibes you get from playing Genshin, you're only gonna find playing Genshin. Genshin also has plenty of memorable locations that you can easily remember. For me, some of my favorite ones are the big Windrise tree in the coast nearby, I think it's called Falcon Coast or something, Wangshu Inn with its 360 panoramic view and Dragon Spine in the backdrop, Guyun Stone Forest Archipelago, the surface of the chasm, Seirai Island with a giant thunder funnel in the center, Watatsumi Island with its giant whirlpool, the Apom Woods rainforest, both old and new Vanarana, the mausoleum while it still has its, giant flame canopy, which I wish you could still turn back on, Tunigi Hollow and the weird portal in the sky, the water lines of Fontaine, and the giant abandoned tower in Southeast Fontaine, just to name a few. Whereas, I can't remember a whole lot of special locations in Wuwa that mean a lot to me or that I can remember easily. Like, the ones that I can recall off the top of my head are like the entrance to the Morning Aches' spawn location, I think it was, with the spiral tree limbs or whatever. That looked pretty cool. The giant ring structures and the huge, dragon rock formation that you can see on Mount Firmament, and the huge statues up at the very north of the map. I do want to give a special mention to my personal favorite locale in Wuwa so far though, the destroyed port city of Guishu, with its destroyed, the ruined highway ramps and the floating broken skyscrapers. Ironically, while I'm not a big fan of of Wuwa's whole like post-apocalyptic vibe so far. I fucking love the whole like urban decay aesthetic and like the theme, like that sort of theme, and the idea of like a giant abandoned city. So like Guishu is an easy home run in my book. The only way that I think they could have made it better is if they had also flooded the city like entirely, so that the whole place is partially inundated or something, which I think some parts of Guishu are, like they do have water, but it's not the whole place. Also, the fact that its soundtrack, Wuwa's soundtrack that is largely forgettable is quite disappointing, like considering this is coming from a developer whose other game, Punishing Gray Raven, apparently has a fantastic soundtrack. A big reason why Genshin's exploration was so memorable and so vibey was thanks to its godlike soundtrack and its main producer, the god himself, Mr. Chen. So Kuro Game really needs to work on their own soundtrack game. Like I did hear that, Vanguard Sound Studio was like busy or something, I don't know exactly what. So now that Kuro Games got some money under the belt from their first couple of banners so far, they should probably find a way to hire them again or something like that. Just saying. All this to say, unfortunately, Wuthering Waves just so far hasn't had the same punch as Genshin did for me back in the day. Now, I will concede that if Wuwa had come out before Genshin, or, if Genshin ever existed in the first place, I most likely wouldn't make such a big deal out of its visuals. Because, hey, if I don't compare it to anything else, Wuwa still looks good, right? It's passable, it's serviceable. And I believe that, Wuwa also runs on, UE4, Unreal Engine 4, while Genshin runs on Unity, so there may be some engine differences that can explain some of the visual discrepancies between these games that, I'm not completely familiar with. But we don't live in that timeline now, do we? And this video is mainly about comparing Wuwa to Genshin, so unfortunately, this is an L that I have to give to Wuthering Waves. Remember earlier how I said that it felt like, Kuro Game focused primarily on getting their combat right? Well, it seems to me that they've had to sacrifice some of their effort on, working on the visuals of the game in order to do so, and it shows. And for some of you, that's okay, because you'd rather them work on the actual game, the gameplay part itself, rather than how it looks. And if this weren't a gacha game, right, I would 100% agree that for more normal games, graphics are in fact secondary to the gameplay. But the truth of the matter is that this is a gacha, and because gacha games at their core are designed to be casual, or at least appeal to a casual audience, right? Visuals and by extension the overall vibes of these gacha games must matter if their developers care about having their games be as successful as possible. So I hope Kuro Game can dedicate more resources and manpower to work on Wuwa's visuals, and luckily it seems like they're already doing just that, because I think that Mount Firmament, our newest 1.1 region expansion at the time of me writing this video, is a step up over the regions that we started with. So hopefully they keep it up, and I'm looking forward to how much better Wuthering Waves might look in the future. The second main thing that I would like to see improved, assuming this is even possible in the first place, is the story. Now, hold up, didn't I just say earlier that I don't really care for the story because, I have a skip button now? So like, why am I about to talk about the story again? I did, yes, but it's not exactly the story in Wuwa specifically that I have a problem with, but more so its general direction, I guess you could say, that it shares with other Chinese gacha games. To put it bluntly, most, if not all, Chinese gacha games more or less follow the same base cookie-cutter formula when it comes to their stories. You typically play as an oftentimes self-insertable protagonist, right, who's usually blessed with some kind of like divine mandate of heaven or some shit that makes them like special. They're always beloved by all the good guys that they run into, to the point where even some of their enemies in story also want them too for their own reasons, of course. And you're always a good guy, right, who can do no wrong, and you're always fighting against the very obviously bad guys, oftentimes in the form of some, like, big bad main enemy faction that's hell-bent on destroying the world, or the universe, or whatever the fuck, right? Yeah, different stories may feature, like, different twists and turns, or might deviate here and there, but for the most part, this is the template that they all pretty much follow. My understanding of Wuwa's original story back when it was still in beta, as I wasn't able to get into any of them myself, was that the initial crew of Resonators like Yang Yang, Chixia, and Baiji, I think her name is, they find Rover when Rover first arrives at Solaris 3, but they don't treat them like a god, like right off the gate, because they don't know who they are, Rover that is, or how Rover got there in the first place. So when I first heard that, right, I got really excited because finally, a Chinese gacha whose story doesn't involve, like the rest of the fucking cast, fucking sucking you off as soon as you start playing. Like, I don't mind if a few games, right, here and there give you the, the god complex treatment as the main character, but after 7 Chinese gacha games that all basically do that to varying degrees, like, I'd like to see something a little bit different, Not to mention, I personally prefer the kind of story where you have to work to earn people's respect and prove their doubts about you wrong, since I feel like they're a lot more satisfying to read. In the case of Wuwa's original story, right, I would have loved to read it if it were about how Rover, when they arrive at Solaris 3, works to prove to the Resonators that they are in fact trustworthy and competent. They are in fact someone who's worthy of their respect and adoration. They could have been written to be the biggest, Gary Stu or Mary Sue ever. I don't care. I don't fucking care, because I care much more about the main character actually putting in the work to earn people's trust and respect, rather than just having it handed to them on a silver fucking platter like what happens in most Chinese gachas. So you can imagine my disappointment when the opening scene of Wuthering Waves looks like this. And when I learned about how the Chinese players apparently didn't like the original script of Wuwa and demanded that Kuro game change it to something that they were more familiar with, aka the whole god complex treatment shit, because apparently the Chinese players fucking love that shit. I mean, hey, guess I can't blame them, because, there's a reason why isekai became such a big thing in Japan, right? It's just that when I think back to when Kuro game was, flexing about how they had to rewrite like 90% of their original script, I just can't help but think to myself, huh, no wonder it only took 6 months. Honestly, I don't know what Kuro game can do to, like, improve their story to fit more of what I'm personally looking for out of it. Obviously, this is their game, and they can, write whatever story they see fit, which is naturally going to suit their home Chinese audience, duh. But so long as the story continues to be some form of, like, oh, hey, look, there's this new region where you gotta go and solve everyone's problems, and everyone's gonna love you for that shit, right? That skip button on the top left corner of the screen is gonna continue being my left click's best friend. Like, I've dealt with that shit in Genshin for the past 4 years. I don't need to deal with that shit again for another 4. No fucking thank you. Some more specific things that I think Wuwa could still improve upon. The elite bosses in Wuwa cost 60 stamina, or wave plates I think they're called, to exchange for their rewards for some reason, when in Genshin it's always only been 40. There's no condensed resin function in Wuwa that lets you convert your stamina into items that you can use for later, and there's no stamina overflow or stamina like bank system like Star Rail has, where if you cap out on your main stack of stamina, the game still lets you regen stamina in like a secondary reserve at a significantly slower rate though. Though to be fair, I think rumor has it that Kuro game is already working on this for 1.2. Echo XP, specifically the fact that you cannot use echoes as XP fodder for other echoes that you want to level. In Genshin and Star Rail, you can use 5-star artifacts or relics as XP to level up other 5-star artifacts or relics that you plan on leveling up and giving to your characters, but you can't do the same for some reason in Wuthering Waves. I mean, technically you can, but you can only use echoes that have already been leveled up themselves as XP fodder. Obviously, you'd rather, ideally, strongbox gold artifacts or relics so that you can reroll them into new ones that might have the stats that you're looking for, yeah. But for early game, when you're still in the middle of like building up your roster and your resources are quite limited, being able to use unwanted gear as XP fodder is very important, so the fact that Wuthering Waves doesn't let you do this for whatever reason is a big letdown. One of my YouTube viewers explained to me that this is intentional, because the devs apparently don't want players to just infinitely farm the whole damn map, grinding echoes every day, and eventually burn themselves out. That, and if you could just farm the entire map for echo XP, what would be the point of having tacit fields in the first place? The solution to this is actually very simple. Just increase the rewards that the tacit fields give you, specifically the amount of Echo XP canisters, and or decrease the stamina cost of running tacit fields, which by the way are also 60 cost for some reason compared to Genshin's or Star Rail's 40 cost for artifact domains or relic caverns. So again, what the fuck is up with that? Basically, make the tacit fields rewarding enough where people feel less inclined to like wipe the entire map every day for Echo XP. Because here's the thing, you're never gonna completely dissuade people from doing dumb shit like, you know, farming the entire goddamn map for resources, right? Gentle reminder that back in Genshin, people routed daily artifact runs for all the shitty 1, 2, and 3-star artifacts that you could farm for free because they spawn naturally in the overworld. Like, as long as you give any sort of option for people to farm stuff for free, there will always be idiots out there who will do it. So the whole point about, you know, people burning themselves out is invalid because people are gonna do it anyway. Also, if people want to be dumbasses and burn themselves out doing that shit, then fine, that's on them, because those people are also the type of players who will speedrun all the content in a gacha game, right? Within weeks of its release, and then get on social media bitching about how the game had no content or that it didn't have enough. Sound familiar? Don't let a small subset of players ruin a valuable method of leveling gear for the rest of us. While Wuwa combat is for the most part very smooth, the camera still bugs out every so often and pans to like an area that has no enemies there or something, which isn't great, especially when you're in the middle of fighting a boss, which is where I found it happens most frequently. And specifically for gunners, or gunslingers, or whatever we call them, ADSing feels very weird, like your crosshairs has like a really hard time moving like diagonally or something. I also really don't like how if your character gets hit by a strong enemy attack, right, and they get sent flying, there's no way to like break your fall and like get right back into the action. Even in Genshin, which is infamous for not having a lot of defensive options in its gameplay, lets your characters recover quickly after they get sent flying by dashing as soon as they hit the ground. Right? So I find it quite strange that a game like Wuthering Waves, which should have the superior combat gameplay, doesn't let you do the same. Sure, you could probably just say stuff like, you know, oh, skill issue, or just don't get hit forehead, but one, unless your name is Sweetily or Rexlent, shut the fuck up, bitch, you suck at this game too, just like the rest of us. And two, that doesn't change the fact that having no breakfall mechanic makes it feel a little bit too punishing to make a mistake in combat when bosses and harder challenge content in this game already feel much more difficult than anything Genshin ever throws at you, and yet a game like Genshin has this mechanic, and a game like Wuwa where this would actually matter a lot more doesn't? I don't know, feels pretty weird to me, man. It also sucks that sometimes there's just so much shit going on in the middle of a fight that it's hard to see what enemies are doing, especially when there are a lot of enemies and you have to keep track of them all when they try to hit you with something. I got a particular bone to pick with the Morning Aches, or however you pronounce that fucker's name, since it has a move where it like flies up in the air past your camera angle and then swoops down to kidnap you and then fucking easy to drop your ass back down to the dirt if you don't press middle mouse button in time to keep track of it. A part of this is definitely skill issue, of course. Obviously, the more you play, the more you learn to acclimate to a ton of shit just going on your screen, but it still doesn't feel any better after you get hit by something that you know you could have dodged if you just could see it coming. Plus, there are other various soft locks and other bugs that Kuro still needs to fix. For example, one of the more recent ones that I ran into was when I was doing one of those like side cube puzzle quest things, I don't know. And after finishing one phase, for some reason the game kept me locked in the bird's eye view camera that you're locked to when you're doing one of those cube puzzle things, and then my movement controls were also fucked up. And the last thing I got here is the Elusive Realm game mode. While as a whole it's a great game mode, basically simulated universe from Star Rail, I don't like how the difficulty ramps up so fucking high that by the time you reach the final difficulty, right, Elusive Realm 5 or whatever, if you get hit once by the second to last or like the final boss or whatever, you're pretty much dead. It's a similar critique that I have against the higher difficulties of like the Sim Universe spin-off modes in Star Rail, like Swarm and Gold Gears. Like, why is it this much of a pain in the ass to fucking clear? right? If the reward for beating Elusive Realm 5 were a lot more than just, you know, a couple of gold tuners or like 10 astrite or some shit like that, then yeah, that'd be understandable, making the game mode that hard because, you know, the payoff might justify slogging through Realm 5 enough times until you can actually beat it. But as of right now, that's not really the case. Also, I don't understand why Elusive Realm is being treated like a limited time game mode, because right now, the way it's being handled is that it's here for 3 or 4 weeks, and then it goes offline and you can't access it again until a new version of Elusive Realm is released, right? Why not just make it a permanent feature that has rewards that reset every week or so, like what Star Rail does with Sim Universe? Quick update, Elusive Realm's max difficulty isn't so bad now that I have some fully invested characters. I do love me some Chun-Li after all, but still not a fan of basically getting 2-shot on the final boss and getting my ass sent back to the lobby. I should also add that I'm actually okay with bosses doing a ton of damage, specifically for the dedicated challenge stages that you can find throughout the map, since if you die or mess up, you can retry instantly. But dying right at the end of an Elusive Realm run sucks, because you gotta go spend another 15 to 20 minutes to go through the entire thing all over again. And finally, according to recent Twitter leaks, allegedly Kuro Game does plan to make Elusive Realm a permanent game mode from 1.4 onwards, which, needless to say, is very good. Anyways, that's all I've got for now, and hopefully y'all aren't too pissed about what I had to ramble about here, and if you aren't, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. I also dual stream to both YouTube and Twitch, twitch.tv/ToeSniper98, so stop by if you want to hang out and talk about gacha. Check out the Patreon too, if you want to see your name show up at the end of these videos, and until next time, be cool y'all, and see you in the next one.